as you flagged there, I started out studying Chinese, and I worked in manufacturing for a while after that, and for about 4 or 5 years. But then I moved into a broader government policy role in the UK civil service, and I worked in a variety of government roles in the UK, and then later in Australia. But it was, and all that time I still had pretty minimal exposure to economics, even though I was working in a policy environment. It was really when I undertook my first master's degree. It was in, as you mentioned, public policy management at Carnegie Mellon. It's an American university that had a branch campus in South Australia. And as well as a variety of policy and strategy subjects, we also did a number of quant subjects. So we did microeconomics, macroeconomics, statistics, econometrics, cost-benefit analysis. And it was really through that I first got the sense of it, particularly regression analysis in econometrics, and what that could do, what that could bring to understanding policy questions and understanding how you could measure the effect of, say, a government policy intervention on a desired outcome. And I think it was particularly that more than say general micro or macroeconomics. And it's interesting because I talked to a lot of colleagues at Treasury, and they'll often be sure you'll have folks who are really interested in just about everything that economics has to offer, but you'll often get folks who are, well, I'm really not interested in micro, I'm just interested in macro, or I'm really interested in a particular area of micro more than anything else. And then you have folks who just are very interested in what the tools like econometrics can bring to the to policy analysis in general. So I guess I fall in that category in particular, in that what got me interested in it in the field of economics was specifically a suite of analysis tools that we broadly call econometrics, and what that could add to understanding what effects government policy have on the desired outcomes. So that was
wonderful.
Was the trigger.
Wonderful, excellent. It has been a little while since I've spoken to somebody who identified the econometrics and the maths and the quant and the analysis around that. So would you be able to elaborate more on that? Because the maths around economics tends to either be something that attracts students because they love economics in high school and they are maths orientated, or deters students because they love economics as a high school subject, but maths might not be their strongest subject. So would you be able to paint a bit of a picture as to the level of maths involved?
Sure. I mean, maths certainly wasn't I did, when I first went to university, and in the UK, you specialize a lot more at high school. You do like 3 or 4 subjects rather than, the 5 or 6 we do in New South Wales. And so I did all languages at high school, and so I didn't do maths right to year 12. And so I had to do a bit of catch up there when I started to learn econometrics. So I guess it's a particular branch of statistics that you learn, but I think that it's what it tells you, or what you can learn from it about the relationships between variables, is so interesting and offers so much in terms of informing policy analysis, that you kind of even I think those who are interested enough in it, even if they don't have the strong maths background, they're willing to do the backup work just because it's just enough to get there to understand, enough to run the models. So I guess that a way of thinking about it, and I'm not sure how much of this your students will do it in year 12, but if you just think about a basic graphing a y variable against the next variable, and you think, well, this changes this much, the y variable changes this much when the x variable changes this much. Well, it's kind of trying to find that relationship from a whole set of real data, and trying to make that relationship, identify what that relationship is when you don't know it beforehand. And and it's that's just a really powerful, tells a really powerful story. Let's say you want to understand, say, you want to understand what causes children to do well or less well, say, in high school. So there's a whole range of things that can influence that. Yes, of course, how well they study, how hard they study, but it can also be a number of background factors in the home. It can be a number of factors affecting how much access they had to early childhood education. There's a whole range of things. So you really need to have access to a wide range of data to be able to start developing different models to look at, well, if this changes in someone's environment, how much does that affect what happens in the future? And the same you could say in a lot of health and epidemiology. Epidemiology came to the fore a lot in during the pandemic. Of course, a lot of the tools that epidemiologists use, a lot of the models, are quite similar to some of the models that economists use. So that again, they want to understand what's going on, what are happening with the X variables that affects the Y variable. So what affects say transmissibility of COVID. Now I'm not an epidemiologist, but I mean, I guess I know enough that there are similar types of models that a whole range of social scientists, not just economists, use to understand what effect things are having on society, on individuals. Sure, economists generally often think in terms of more traditional, conventional economic outcomes, so like income, production, employment, those kinds of things. But the same applies in a whole range of social, environmental, industrial settings. Just when you're trying to understand what drives an outcome that you're trying to understand. So I think that's, for me, that when I first came across that, it was just such revelation, because working in government policy at the time and since then, it was clear to me that it was hugely important to understand what drove what, to be able to inform good government policy decisions.
Wonderful. Excellent. Excellent. So it does seem, if I'm understanding you correctly, there is a little bit of maths involved in the field of econometrics and economic analysis, and I don't think any student would be surprised at that. But if maths as a student is not your strong suit, if it is something that you do struggle with, but you are willing to learn and willing to work, then it's not so advanced that it's a big gate or obstacle that keeps people out. The maths is not that advanced for students who are, as long as they're willing to learn, which if you're going into any subject in university, you're obviously going to learn. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
That's right.
At this point, everybody in the chat, feel free, if you have any question that you would like to ask, feel free to ask that in the chat, and we'll try to get that question to Kevin as well. Here's another question though for you, Kevin, from me. Probably to help students better understand the type of work that you would do in the field of economics or for Treasury or anything like that. A lot of the students, they understand fields such as engineering or accounting or med, where the degree or the subject area almost directly goes into a specific job, and usually a job that they can envision. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on the day-to-day or the practical work, so that way the teenagers in the room can have an understanding as to what work you do or you've done in the past?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about what I do and done in the past. I'll maybe give it a couple of examples of what other colleagues do as well or have done. So at the moment, there's a few teams in our division, and so one of the teams is called the macro analysis team, and essentially they forecast macroeconomic variables. So the team's role is to try to estimate what is going to happen with employment, production, wages, interest rates, inflation, those kinds of things. And specifically, they want to know what's going to happen. I want to estimate what's going to happen in the next 4 years. So we work in the New South Wales Treasury, and the Treasury is the state government department that really holds the purse strings. So we have to allocate the spending, or we have to inform the government's decisions about allocating spending across the next 4 years. So in order to allocate spending, you need to know how much you're going to have to spend. So there's another element of the forecasting there, which is the revenue forecast or the tax forecasts. But in order to be able to forecast those, we need to know what we think is going to be happening in the economy, because a lot of what's happening in the economy drives how much revenue we receive as a government. So if I give you an example, so there's the macro team that does the macro forecast. There's the revenue forecasting team that does the tax forecasts. So let's take one thing. Let's take two things. Let's take wages and employment. So the macro team will try to estimate what's going to happen to levels of employment over the next 4 years in New South Wales. They'll also try to estimate what's going to happen to wages over the next 4 years. Now, then once we have the team's forecast for those two variables, then the revenue forecasting team, they try to understand what's going to be happening to the tax revenues coming to the government, so the government has money to spend over the next 4 years. Now, one of those things is something called payroll tax. Now, a lot of students may not have heard of this, but it's something that employers pay to the state government as one of the taxes, and it's one of the sources of revenue for state governments. Again, in order to be able to understand how much we have to spend, that tax, which can be around, about $10 billion a year in New South Wales, for example, we need to do a forecast, because if we have a margin of, if we get that wrong, say by 10%, that's $1 billion that we may have. If we get it wrong by $1 billion, that means we might spend $1 billion more than we have, or we might have not planned to spend $1 billion, but we end up having. So government does a whole lot of things. State governments, they fund the schools. The schools that a lot of students will be attending will be funded through the funding allocated to education departments by treasuries. They fund the hospitals, build roads, provide a whole range of social services. In order to be able to do that, governments need funding, and funding comes primarily through taxes. And in order to plan for how much we're spending, we need to understand how much we're going to have. And all of that is only made possible by forecasting. And forecasting uses those econometric techniques that I was talking about before. It uses some of those techniques, but it also based on it's not just about using models. It's also about developing an intuitive understanding about what's going on in the economy. And on the revenue side, it's also developing an understanding of how reactive, say, revenue receipts are to different things happening in the economy. So it's not just about running models. It's about all the time trying to deepen your understanding of the relationships between what's happening in the economy and how much revenues we receive in government, and be able to give government as accurate an estimate as possible of what revenues the government will have to spend, so that the government can. So if you think about, let's say your students have got they've got a Saturday job, they've got some might have some pocket money from their parents, they might have other revenue sources. And if you want to plan for your a big purchase that you want to make down the track, you want to have an estimate of what money you're going to be receiving over the coming months. Otherwise, you won't know how to plan for that. Well, in government, it's the same, but it's just that we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, and an error of sort of 5 or 10% can be a huge error in effect that we don't want to. We want to minimize that error as much as possible.
Yes, excellent. I do think, I'd imagine most of the students might have been at least somewhat tapped into the federal budget, released this week. And so, the $4 billion surplus and all of that sort of stuff has gotten a lot of, media attention. So it seems like to me that the significance of trying to be as accurate as possible with those estimates, because the estimates themselves have very significant ramifications for future policy and things like that.
That's right. And when the government's talking about a future surplus, it's actually just talking about a forecast future surplus.
Yes.
It's talking about its planned spending,
yes,
but controlling for its forecasts revenue.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's always hugely impacted by that.
Yes.
I'll talk a little bit, Justin, because that's
Mm.
just that one sort of specific set of examples, but there's a whole range of areas. So in the group, so there are four divisions in our group in Treasury that pretty much either all economists or I'd say about 80% are economists or have some economics training. So there's a whole variety of roles within that, and they would look at things like housing. So how can we plan? How can we encourage the building of more affordable housing? What kind
Oh,
of
wow. Yep.
mechanisms can government use to encourage that? How about what can we do to maximize competition?
Mm.
So your students will probably have learned a bit about monopolies and
Mm.
so what can government do in order to minimize monopolistic behavior and encourage more
Mm.
competition between firms? When does government need to regulate to enforce behaviors which otherwise might have, to minimize risk of injury,
Mm.
say, to
Yeah.
members of the public? There's things like cost benefit analysis. So if you want to build a bridge or a road, economists will try to calculate, well, what's the economic benefit of the road? How long is the road going to be here for? And if you take all its value over the years, what would that value be right now?
Mm.
Um, and um, and therefore, is that value equal to or greater than the cost or less than the cost of building the road in the first place? So we
Yep.
talk about benefit cost ratios, and so when you look at all the costs and look at all the benefits, if the benefit doesn't exceed the cost, then you probably shouldn't build it. So understanding what those benefits are involves a whole range of economic calculations and assumptions as well. There's evaluation, so looking at policies that the government delivers and evaluating whether they're actually having that. I was talking before about education and health outcomes. If the government is spending money, is it having the outcomes that the original decision was intended
Mm.
for? Another way is tax policy. So I was talking about tax forecasting, but um, and this is Commonwealth tax policy, but students might have heard about something called negative gearing, because that's often
Mm.
in the news. So that's where if somebody has an investment property and the expense of on maintaining and paying for the property is greater than what you earn from that, then you can offset that against
Mm.
other tax, and that's a very controversial tax policy because it's a lot of folks would argue that it means that a lot more investors than would otherwise be the case are holding properties and pushing up property prices, and that's making it
Yeah.
difficult for young
Yeah.
folks to get onto the property market.
Yeah. So we've read a little bit about the argument that that negative gearing, at least from a certain perspective, it reduces the incentive to have a tenant if you know that the losses or the absence of that rental income would contribute to the lowering of your taxable income. Is that sort of what you're
Yeah, I
describing?
mean, essentially, but it's a cross subsidized. It's a subsidization really of the tax loss, because
Mm.
if the tax loss wasn't being subsidized um, by other taxpayers, then investors might behave in a different way.
Yes.
And so that might that it would, because how you tax essentially changes behavior, and
Mm.
how people behave and what their utilities are is all about it's all tied into how you understand economic behavior generally.
Yes.
Um,
Wonderful. Wonderful. Excellent. It does seem like we've already touched a little bit on this, but there's like a natural segue here. We do have a question in the chat that is, and especially since relevant to you, since you do have a strong background in politics, do you have any advice for high school students that are interested in the intersections of the political science or just government full on and economics. For example, many of the universities offer, political economy or international economics, or politics, philosophy, and economics is a degree that kind of that a lot of universities provide. So the intersection of politics and economics. Any advice for students that seems to be their bread and butter? They like both of those worlds.
Sure, I think that your student answered the question. I think PPE is a really good choice. I was talking a few months ago to the son of a friend of ours who was doing PPE at one of the unis here in Sydney, and I was saying how exciting, because it's the best of all worlds in a way, because it gives you exposure to enough economics, but also in the context of how the political sphere works, how in the context of how institutions work. And one of the reasons why that's important is because economic models are just models. In reality, they operate in the real world and in the context of institutions and everyday politics. And so, for example, just because something seems economically rational based on a model, when you're advising a minister, that minister has a whole range of other factors to influence their decision, not least of which what their party might have stated about their commitment to a particular policy, which may or may not align with that model, because usually in any government policy there are winners and losers. And who those winners and losers are and how vocal the losers or the potential winners are has an influence on ministers as well. So understanding all those dynamics is something anyway you learn when you come into government, but actually being exposed to some of it through learning something like politics, philosophy, and economics at university, I think is a really interesting pathway. Having said that, we do in government recruit from a wide variety of specializations. So there are a number of different graduate programs. There's we do have a Treasury graduate program, and we actually have a specific Treasury graduate economist program. And we do bring folks into that from economics and other streams that include economics. But in addition to that, there's a much broader public service commission graduate program, which recruits graduates from all across the disciplines. And then what they would tend to do is they would rotate. I think there might be 3 or 4 rotations across different. They'll have a home agency, and they'll do rotations in other agencies as well. So they'll see a little bit of how government works across a variety of teams and at least a couple of different agencies. And then after their rotations, they'll start to develop a sense of, well, what part of government would I really be interested in working in, what part of policy, start to think about a pathway. So definitely, and as I said, I'm someone who came into interest in economics via an interest in policy, in government policy. So there's very much an overlap there, and there's a number of people, say, working in Treasury and in other agencies who have general public policy roles in a variety of areas that also have economics training, and they might not work as economists, but their understanding of economics will have definitely helped them in their work, because it will give them some really useful frameworks for thinking about problems. I mean, yes, you want to think about if there's a political problem, a policy problem, you do have to sometimes look at it through a political lens, through a social lens, through an environmental lens, through an economic lens. Of course, economists would argue that all of those are just variations of economic lenses.
Of the economic lens, yes.
But regardless, I mean, you have to think about all those different dimensions when thinking about a policy problem. And so, regardless of which part of government you end up working in, having studied economics is going to turn out to be really, really useful for understanding that.
Yes, excellent. It definitely seems like you're describing much more of a human and a valuing society and a caring about social problems as the draw or as the
That's
lure for students. Like, they care
that's a
about the
really good.
world, they want to
Yeah,
make an impact, they want to solve some of these problems. It's not just about spreadsheets and numbers and dollars and things like that. That economics is in large part, possibly more so, about understanding how society ticks and how to address the problems that don't have a clear cut, simple answer.
that's right. I think that's a great point to raise because almost invariably when I talk to people in government about what drew them to government in the first place, it almost invariably is about making a difference. So there are plenty of other career paths open to people who work in government. The reason they stay in government often is because of the values alignment, because they get to work on things that make a difference in society. And I know quite a few people that have gone from government to consulting or to a bank, and not everyone, but a lot of them have gone and then come back because it just didn't have that same values alignment that had drawn them to government in the first place. So yeah, look, that's a really important point, that it's a big driver for, I'd say, the vast majority of people that move into government is because they feel like it's a career that will give them an opportunity to make a difference, because you'll be working on advice to government that can really make a difference. If government comes to power, and sure, the cabinet, the elected politicians, they absolutely have the power of decisions on policy and which legislation to take to Parliament. But these things are hugely complex, and they can't do that without detailed advice from public servants, and whether that be from economists or with the whole vast array of public servants that work in the agencies on policy advice. So what that often consists of is presenting analysis of, let's say the government has a particular stated objective. I want to deliver this service to 200,000 households by the end of next year. So the analysis would include, well, what are the costs of that? What are the types of households that we think we might be able to reach, who we might not be able to reach, and why? What are some of the risks? What are some of the perverse behaviors that it might? Because if you spend money a particular way, it might cause some people to behave in a way that you hadn't necessarily wanted. It does not everyone reacts in the same way, and so it can have perverse impact. So that's the kind of advice that policy analysts provide to government. And when it comes to economics, it will often be about, well, if we regulate this industry in this way, well, these behaviors will probably stop. But look, this other behavior
there might be some other impacts
pop up somewhere else, or we might cause these smaller businesses to go bankrupt because they're so small they wouldn't be able to afford the fixed costs of adjusting to. So then you might want to design a program that mitigates the impact of that for businesses below a certain size. Or you might say have think about some kind of implementation transition. So you might give them you might give smaller businesses, say, an extra 6 months or 12 months to comply. So there's a whole range of things that you need to think about that might be the effects of government policy decisions, and provide that advice to ministers. The ministers absolutely have the final say, and well, they have the final say about what to bring to Parliament. Parliament has the final say. Often the government that's in power has the numbers in Parliament to ensure that goes through. But they do that really on the back of advice from policy analysts and economists in a wide variety of roles.
Yes, wonderful. Maybe just one more question, if we can continue, if you're okay with that, Kevin.
Sure.
Sort of now from your perspective, from the opposite angle now, if we're still talking about high school students or even people who are approaching 20 years old, maybe they're in university, would you be able to describe the type of attributes or the type of students, the type of young person that you would say, oh yes, work for us, work for me? Not only would you be successful in a career in economics, but you would be doing it for the right reasons. You would be engaged and find fulfillment in it. What type of young person would you say is right for this type of career path?
Economics, so economics in general. We're not just talking about public policy now. We're talking about economics in general.
I
So
think so. Yes.
I think that an interest in how the world works. So I was talking about sort of before about looking at a y and x graph, and like how the when the x variable changes, what happens to the y variable. So being really curious about those kinds of things in real life. Like, are you really curious about what would improve literacy among say remote communities? Are you really interested in understanding how here's a good one. Are you really interested in understanding what the impact of AI is going to have on employment in the future? Say, if you're really interested in questions about how things that are happening in society will affect people in society, will affect companies, then I think if you're really curious about those things, then economics is definitely should definitely be of interest. I think if you're you should have a curiosity with numbers. You should be at least interested in say thinking about how impacts are quantified, how you should have some. I mean, I think if you like looking at data visualizations and that kind of, that's probably an interesting one. Because data visualization has really come a long way in recent years. If you like looking at different charts that tell you really interesting things about what are happening in society, then economics is probably for you.
Wonderful. Okay, excellent. I especially love the curiosity element of that. That it wasn't that your response wasn't necessarily, if you're good at this, this, and this, then we want you to work for us. It was more, it's a curiosity. It's the answering the really complex questions. We do have one last quick question, very practical, the most practical and obvious from a young person who's trying to work out what career path. Is the pay? I'm reading this word for word. Thank you, Andy. Is the pay as an economist good?
Sorry
to put you on the spot there, Kevin.
No, look, I think that the pay for economists is I don't have the stats with me. I think it's pretty good. I think that it depends where you work as an economist. So I think the pay as for an economist, as for a government economist, is pretty good, but it probably not as high. We do occasionally lose some young economists to, say, the banks. So occasionally we'll have a young person come in as a graduate and work for 2 or 3 years, and then they'll get poached by one of the banks because they can offer them quite a bit more. So yeah, if you want to work as an economist in one of the merchant banks, then yeah, the pay can potentially be really quite high. But look, I think that working as an economist, a policy analyst / economist in public service is a good living wage. But as I say, there's a variety of different roles. So it will depend where you go, but I would think it ranges from good to very good.